welcome the moderator of the next session, Steve Clemons and Mr. Michael Chertoff.
Michael, welcome to my living room here. Greetings, everyone. Let me just say a few words. We have this wonderful Slido program that allows you to ask questions, pose questions, and you can either do it live or you can do it here. I'd encourage you to not do it anonymously. It's wonderful to put, names and get all. And we've got a great group coming up. So the more that we can do this as a one-room discussion, get as many questions, make this a conversation, that'll be great. I also know that there are a lot of members of the Global Young Leaders Forum here. Raise your hands if you're a G. Wow, so you're all right out there. Yeah, thank you for being here. And so we're going to give you guys a little ramp up. So think of some super smart questions. And we took off our ties. This is on Silicon Valley data. So we're kind of getting rid of that New York bankers look, or maybe the Munich bankers look, or whatever. But so if you guys want to leave your ties on, that's up to you. But we've taken them off. Michael, let's talk about your new book and open this up on exploding data. And I want to ask you about the book, but I want to ask you a more cosmic question at the beginning. Is you've laid out in this book, and I've just read the blurbs, it actually comes out July 6th, and it is available on Amazon globally.
Correct.
For pre-orders. So
exactly.
Is it expensive?
Not enough.
Yeah, okay. So I guess the question I want to start out with is, when you think about a society as an ecosystem, or even like a biological system, sometimes choices are made.
Sure.
And our society, the Western world, and now the world globally, took a digital path. The internet was found. Communications were there. We've all become more interconnected. And for a time, that felt good. Everyone saw the benefits. And you've been waiving your concerns about laws, norms, practices, and said society as we know it could really be undermined by what's going on. So I guess my cosmic question to you is there a chance, if democracies are ultimately undermined, that this digital track was a mistake?
I think it's a choice, and part of what the book is about is making a mindful choice, understanding that when we decide to sign up for things or agree to things, there are implications. A technology like the internet, just like the printing press, is inherently neutral. But as is often the case, it can easily be exploited for bad purposes, or it can be turned to good purposes, but that is in our control. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I had a sense that many people only had a very, very hazy idea of what they generate in terms of data and what the implications of that would be. And if people then became conscious of what they generate and mindful about when they decide to agree to something or not, we would then have more control over our lives.
Mm-hmm. You'll notice he says data, I say data.
Because I'm from New Jersey.
There was this song in there somewhere. But let's take it a step further. Now that you've kind of been looking at the infrastructure of the cloud, of where data is placed, and one of the things I find interesting about how you've set the book up as we think about norms and laws and sort of the fragilities of the system is that where your data sits matters. What the rules around it are matter. And so we were talking at one point, I remember a year or 2 years ago, if you had a data center in Brazil, for instance, and you had certain rules about accessing that in criminal cases. Sometimes these criminal cases can be contrived for corporate, interest reasons. Sometimes they're real. So what do you put on the table as a way to address some of the real fragilities over personal information and even corporate information?
Well, so a couple of points on this. So one is the data does not necessarily live within borders. It moves around. It crosses borders. Often where it's housed, at least for a period of time, is driven by technological considerations. So that creates two sets of issues. One is which government law actually applies. And we've seen a lot of conflict in this respect. Mentioning Brazil, Brazil has a couple of times threatened to put Microsoft executives in jail because they wouldn't turn over data that was actually housed in the U.S. that is subject to U.S. laws. And Europe has done the same thing with some of the U.S. platform providers. And so there's discussion about how do you reconcile these things. But the second issue with the cloud is this. People think about the choices they make in terms of I've signed up for Facebook or I've signed up for something else, and so they have my data. And that's true, but that's only a part of it. Everybody here who is going to tweet or write about what they're seeing here or even take a picture of us is also going to create data about Steve and me. And then it's not just going to be data that's sitting on your individual accounts or in your phones or your computers, but if you upload it to the cloud, which probably most of you do given the way they configure the IT these days, the cloud provider will now be able to look at all of the data you've collected about Steve and me, and if they choose, the cloud provider can aggregate it and do something with it. And so the point is that when you have the cloud, you are able to collect and analyze and make use of data far more comprehensively than most people actually understand when they go about their day-to-day business.
I want to read one of these blurbs, which is so interesting. It says, this important book offers highly intelligent commentary, must be someone who wants to make you feel good here, of a kind that I've not read elsewhere on the challenges posed by the technology revolution and the accompanying explosion of data. Michael Chertoff's experience as a leader in national security, where we work together, brings exceptional insight to issues we spend so much time talking about and find difficult to understand. He explains the pervasive implications for individual privacy, personal safety, national security, and international relations. He highlights key issues often overlooked, notably the role of data analytics. I especially recommend the advice on how best to approach private sector encryption and the balance between privacy and security, et cetera, et cetera. Sir John Scarlett, Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6 in the UK.
Right.
Quite an endorsement. But I was interested in this data analytics time. Talking to General John Allen of Brookings, who recently became president of Brookings, and I said, what's the big net add that you've added to the Brookings? Some people say in Washington, if any of you know Washington, we have the Pentagon, and then next we have Brookings. It's like a monstrosity of a think tank. And he said that really what he's bringing is that every group at Brookings really needs to develop a facility for major data analytics and to bring that in there. So he's talking about it as an earnest, forward-looking, positive step. My sense is you have big concerns about data.
And as I said, with most of the features of the modern technology, there's a plus and a minus. There are many good things you can do with data analytics, including, we were talking about counterterrorism in an earlier panel. It's a very, very effective way to analyze who in the pool of people who are crossing borders might pose a threat. But at the same time, look at Cambridge Analytica. It can be used as a very efficient way of targeting ways to undermine society and create disorder and dissension. So the analytics themselves are neutral, but the way in which it's applied and the effect it has on your life is very significant. And I begin the book with 4 scenarios that are, to some degree, except for the last one, based on things that actually go on now, that show the way in which data can be used to influence and even coerce you. But what I'm really, at one point, posing in the book is the image of the private sector, not even talking about the government, collecting so much data about what you eat, how you drive, how your sleep is, and how much you exercise, that in the end, your health insurer could say, your lifestyle, really, we're not happy with it, so we're going to raise your premium rates 300% unless you stop eating this kind of food, you don't drive at night, you limit yourself to 1 glass of wine, and you make sure you get 8 hours of sleep. And we're constantly checking on this because you're generating data about this all the time.
Right.
And that actually it makes Big Brother look like a child's play, and it's what I call Big Nanny.
Let me ask you, I think most people know this, I should have mentioned it, that you were a former Secretary of Homeland Security in the United States. You were a former judge. And I feel as if this topic of cyber sabotage, cyber nefariousness, cyber fragility, and the concerns of what we all need to do to protect ourselves is becoming a bigger and bigger problem, not a smaller and smaller.
Correct.
I mean, there's entire industries being built up around this, and no one seems to be winning. I mean, it seems the needle seems to be moving the wrong direction because we're having this. Why? Particularly looking back at the government role that you played, and Homeland Security has a substantial part of the footprint in this area, why has the U.S. government, and particularly your former department, failed to create the security perimeter that would make us much safer?
Well, because there is no perimeter. I wouldn't say they failed any more than I would say the New York Police Department failed because they haven't eliminated all crime in the city of New York. You
Yeah,
have,
but it's getting worse, right?
this is a problem you have to manage, and much of the control over managing the problem of security lies in private hands because the networks are owned privately. The government does not own the networks, and the government doesn't sit on all the networks. So I think we've improved in some respects, but to your point, there is no perimeter. And originally, there was a thought that cybersecurity was like a Maginot Line. You drew a line around your network and you were safe. That is absolutely a false promise. What you have to do is be living in your network to see when there's a security threat, and you've got to have layers of defense. And the example I use is the human body. Your body is designed to keep out bacteria and viruses and a lot of bad things, but doesn't keep out everything. And therefore, your body has within it defenses, immunities, and white blood cells that are designed to look at something that foreign matter that comes in and decide whether it is dangerous or not. And if it's dangerous, your white blood cells are supposed to overwhelm it and kill it. And that's the model I use for cybersecurity. It's not just your outside shell, but it is being in the network, being in your body, and being able to characterize what is dangerous and what's not dangerous.
Yeah. What do you, when you think about this environment, I mean, I know you put this on there, but what do you think are the other dimensions of the digital world that need attention? Some things that come to mind that are coming up are AI and how AI is going to be applied to this. Does that become a fixer? Does that become something that worsens the scene? You know, as you think about the Internet of Things and how data and machines are all basically talking to one another, does your level of concern begin to move from people's personal information to kind of a different sort of autonomous set of things that are working around us?
Well, the Internet of Things really dramatically expands the surface area for attacks, because what happens is these devices, these so-called smart things like your smart camera, your smart refrigerator, are not generally built or have not been built with any provision for real security or patching or updating. And once you connect them to your network, now you've created an entry point that can infect your entire network. And that happened to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce some years back when they were penetrated by a foreign power through a thermostat in a remote building that was connected to the network. Now, this used to be just thought of as, well, that's your problem. If you allow something to get into your network, it's on you. You're going to pay the consequences. But last year, there was an attack on a domain name registry called Dyn, a massive denial of service attack, far beyond what had been seen previously, which was generated by using these smart devices in a massive botnet. So it no longer became your problem, it became everybody's problem. And I think that is a serious issue of concern.
I think I'm going to go in the audience now and bring up some people just, haphazardly. Oh, there are three really cool people here right now. Would you three mind joining us up on stage, and maybe we can take this a little bit further? I'm going to step over here. And we're going to get in. Thank you. Somebody just posted their first question anonymously, but we'll get to that in a moment. Those of us have joined us are Maritia Schaake, is a member of the European Parliament, but that doesn't quite capture everything. She is one of the great, and this is, I mean in a good term, is one of the great digital divas of the European Parliament. And she is a member of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, of which Samir, I'm going to get to in a moment, Samir Saran is also a commissioner, and that there's going to be a big meeting of that commission here just after the end of GLOBSEC, so I hope some of you can capture that. But she was also the founder of the European Interparliamentary Group on the Digital Agenda for Europe, so very much in your space. We also have Samir Saran, who's the Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, and as I mentioned, a commissioner of the same Global Commission. And we have Olaf Kolkman, who's Chief Internet, just here to my left, Chief Internet Technology Officer of the Internet Society in Amsterdam. And he's been at this forever, so I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. You're not nearly as pierced and tattooed as I would have hoped for someone who had been in the internet for a long time. But I know in 1996, he was part of a group that set up the protocols for the first worldwide test of the network. And I think that's true, right? It's sort of close.
Yeah.
Just go with it. It sounds good.
Yeah, it sounds cool. And I can walk up and fetch my T-shirt with a...
Excellent. Well, I think just moving from some of the concerns that Michael Chertoff, Secretary Chertoff, has put on the table about how to affect the norms, the rules, the laws. Let me just start out with you for a moment, Olaf. Do you think that that we're in the right ballpark when it comes to some of our concerns, or are we missing it and have blind spots in what really matters? How do we prioritize our concerns about the dangers of the digital ecosystem?
So I think we're getting there. I actually think that the general populace and the general audience knows that we're getting there. 2 days ago, there was the CIGI published, together with IPSO, a survey on trust. And the numbers there says that more than half of the internet users around the world are more concerned about their online privacy than they were a year ago.
Mm.
A majority believes that social media and search engines have too much power. That's 63% and 57%.
Which audience was this?
This is a survey of 25,000 people in 25 countries,
Okay.
distributed over the globe.
Mm-hmm.
So global audience. There are differences in perspectives and perceptions. How does social media or social platforms influence your views, your political views? You see a gradient there. Indonesia, 69% people say, yeah, social media platforms influence our view. India, 68%. Egypt, 63%.
Mm.
Russia, 21%. Japan, 28%. Germany, 28%. And Poland, 28%. So there is a change in the perception, but I would say that there is a global awareness that platforms, data, influence our lives and impact the trust that we have in the internet, but also in society.
Mauricio, let me jump to you for a second and ask you about both sides of this and where the equilibrium should be. I mean, I think which is what Olaf was sharing in terms of people's concerns, but yet people overwhelmingly swim in this new and spend all of their time in this new digital universe. You've been a proponent of a digital single market, for instance, in Europe. And I'm just interested in how you get the equities right between the different balances. And one of the things that comes to mind, and you and I were in the Brussels Forum together, I think, we were talking about the trade-off, and I'd love to get some people in the audience then were very furious with my formulation, but I would love to hear from all of you shortly. But we have Google, we have Facebook, we have large platforms. Some have called these platform monopolies that have emerged largely in the United States, not exclusively, but largely in the United States. And these are firms that did not take root and grow in Europe. But it's the European, the GDPR, and others, these new regulatory schemes that have come in to become the dominant regulatory schemes. So it just makes one wonder whether you need a low regulatory environment like the United States to create these big engines, and then you need for society's health and sanity and soul, Europe to come in and be the savior of that. Is that a fair formulation?
Well, I think it remains to be seen, but it was very clear, I think, from what Michael said, how much can change so fast. Also backed up by these Ipsos findings that Olaf was citing about trust, about concern that people have, about the privatization of the digital sphere.
Right.
I mean, unfortunately, very often digitization means privatization already. And I think an awakening is happening on a larger scale after some major incidents, Cambridge Analytica, but also questions about, what is happening on the back end of these platforms that look bright and shiny and are so easy to use. So I believe that the EU has a lot of interesting economic development too. I mean, look at cities like Barcelona, Amsterdam, London, Berlin, where there's so many startups, exciting ideas happening that I really don't think that Silicon Valley is the only ideal, that big tech is the only ideal. And I hope that there will be a balancing out and a reappreciation for the importance of the rule of law online. Because the crowding out of the public interest, the crowding out of a rules-based system online, which, in the post-World War II era has really been built up by Europeans and Americans together because we believed that rules serve the interest of people, that you need some laws to safeguard principles. And I think there's every reason to aspire to have that apply online as well. And in fact, at the UN level, at the EU level, in many places, the notion that rules should apply online as they do offline is broadly accepted. But the main question is how. And I hope that with more appreciation for the concerns in the United States, we can actually find a new partnership towards this.
So I'm going to push you. So that's beautiful what you just said if you're in Amsterdam. But do you think all of that applies equally if you're in Budapest? I mean, I just want to say, people talk about this rule of law. They talk about, to some degree, and and to me, I'll just be honest, it sounds, naive to me to think that this notion that everyone's just going to trust this environment to come in. We live in a world where that sort of world is eroding, of democracy, yes, of rules. It's being taken, and we just can't wish that away. So the Nixonian side of me says, deal with the world as it is. How do you deal with, and with all due respect to those of you who may have a different view, you'll get to say it, in Orban's Hungary today, or somewhere where the rules are manipulated for the benefit of power, as opposed to kind of a broader civil society. I understand you're on the other side of that, but how do you deal with the places where that isn't really the norm?
Well, the problem is, I think that there have been competing systems throughout. I just returned from China last week as one massive example of a different system where top-down governance also of the internet is the norm. And unfortunately, in the heart of Europe, in Budapest, but also to some extent in Poland and other places, we see an erosion of the rule of law, and it is deeply troubling. And I think we need to double down our efforts to actually safeguard these very principles, whether it's online or offline. To me, it doesn't matter. But the fact that there are competing systems is nothing new, but we have to understand how it plays out online. And the different dimension there is the commercialization, for sure, the tension between global span and territoriality of law. I mean, the reason why you can talk about Hungary is because the Hungarian government is able to make laws that apply to its citizens on its territory. Online, we have a whole different ballgame of those dimensions. So what I think has been overlooked, frankly, by the democracies of this world is this systems battle that's also playing out online. I think perhaps similar to how there was a hope, maybe I should say, or an expectation that liberal democracy's success would be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think some people hoped that the open internet would make democracy go viral, and it did not. It's proven to be an extension of agency. So, of course, being online and having platforms to speak on has empowered individuals.
Yeah, it's changed.
But it's also empowered governments and has empowered big companies. So this is how I look at it, and it's a real battle that we have to fight for and not allow others to eat up.
You know, I had one of the early political blogs in Washington, and the internet used to be the place that if you got something wrong, if I got something wrong, I had 10,000 emails the next day on how I had screwed up. In other words, information was so that it became self-correcting, and so I was obligated to sort of respond and to fix what I might have gotten wrong, or sometimes I was playing that role, and so I never had to worry about the kind of fake news syndrome because I thought at that time that the system would self-correct. And this brings me to Samir about his wonderful notions about synthetic truth and how this ecosystem is evolving, because today that alternative view, if I'm accused of getting something wrong, that actually just may be an alternative cocoon, an alternative reality, a different agenda, a Russian bot, or whatever it may be. But now you have competing truths in the system. So Samir,
I'd like to also come in on a point that was raised by Marichir. It's on Orban, and I think that's a very valid question. So I think we need to be more modest and reframe the debate in the various rules of law that exist. I don't think countries are necessarily not following rules of laws. I just believe that many of them have different rules of law. One are permission-based societies, which you require authorization to speak.
Right.
Others are societies where you are only penalized if you do something illegal. So there are two different systems in place, and we must recognize that both of them work within their own frameworks of law and their appreciation of what law is. One of the most important issues that digitization and this whole explosion of data and communication has done is that it has actually weakened these open systems where you're only penalized for illegality. They have weakened it because it's more porous. You're able to influence them. You're able to create fake news, distort the truth, embellish a small truth with bigger lies and give fake news very long legs to run on. On the other hand, regimes which are closed are protected. Governments have huge power using these communication tools, and citizens don't, because citizens don't have the same permissions to participate in the process of creating alternative narratives or challenging the establishment. So in a sense, what we are seeing is the medium that was supposed to support and sustain democratic expansionism is actually restricting and closeting democracy to very few small pockets, whereas Orban says, oh, the China model works, the Russian model works, it's very attractive. Why don't we adopt some part of it to sustain my regime forever? So regimes which are non-democratic are actually finding this medium very useful. And this is counterintuitive. And democracies all over the world are struggling with explosion of conversations that are chaotic many times. But let me
So
tell you,
Orwell saw all of this coming, you're saying?
Orwell was wise, yes. I did not see, I don't think he saw Facebook coming, and I don't think he predicted these big platforms would take away state power in many instances. And I think that's something new, that the non-state is perhaps a more significant interlocutor of citizenship than ever before, and citizenship in its entirety.
Does anybody in the audience have digital-free days? Like, I have this truck that was built in 2002 before there were all those diodes that could be tracked by people, and sometimes I go to cash and leave my iPhone at home. I know it sounds odd, it just happened one day and it made me feel rather good. But I'm just wondering what the implications are of that. That on one hand, while I have my iPhone in my pocket so the NSA knows where I am, or your former friends, or something like that. I mean, it just begins to raise the question of whether or not we need to carve out space that is separate from some of this. I know you're going to jump on some of what Samir said.
Well, I was going to say
yeah.
that I think Orwell really underestimated because in his world, the government put up telescreens and was monitoring what's going on. We're doing it all to ourselves. What is remarkable to me is the number of people who surveil each other and then they post it. And I'm not saying they're doing it for nefarious reasons, but the net effect is you are far much more ubiquitously watched with a combination of government and just private action than Orwell would have dreamed of. So it's hard to really get off the grid. You'd really have to go find a deserted island somewhere with no power in order to get away from all this.
Olaf, you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think that's part of the underlying problem. The amount of information that you get, the snippets of perceived truth.
Right.
We were talking yesterday when we got introduced that I enjoy the long read of The Atlantic.
Yeah.
We don't
Thank
do
you,
that.
by the way.
Yeah, but we don't do that anymore. The tweet is grabbing our attention, and that provides us with the truth. Now that's not something new.
It's not new.
It's not something new. The way that media and news is controlled, and in free societies, fake news spreading faster and being more pervasive in free society is nothing new. The pamphlet culture in the 17th century.
The scandal mongers.
Is something that has existed for years and years and years. The scale is different.
Yeah, I think, but there's a difference. The difference is this, that when democracy wanted to spread, so you had countries in the Atlantic system that invested in institutions, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Brookings, the Human Rights Watch, the Amnesty Internationals, the big, the long reads that we are discussing. They would spread the message to people, attract them, create regime change, sometimes also create the colored revolutions and certain other political outcomes in Central Europe, Eastern Europe. So you had investments, you had purpose, you had decades of transformation. Now you have a $1.6 trillion economy, 1.3 at last count, Russia, which has completely delegitimized a $16 trillion American democracy. A small country, in a few months' time, has at least done one of the three things. Either elected the president, or put the impression that they have elected the president, and three, delegitimize the entire electoral infrastructure. So no one trusts whether outcomes were genuine or manufactured. So I think this is what is different. in the scalability, the velocity, and the rapidity, and the asymmetry. So non-state actors, and now imagine this is Russia. Let's
Right.
assume it is not Russia. A bunch of small people can change governments potentially, can delegitimize democratic processes potentially.
But the technology is really important. So that is different. So maybe the ambition to spread propaganda, to undermine trust, to mislead people is not a new phenomenon. But of course, targeted ads, very powerful algorithms, the merging of different data sets is fundamentally different. And in fact, one of the problems that I see is that we don't have oversight over the black boxes behind all these algorithms.
Right.
So we don't know whether people with different skin color, religion, political views, sexual orientation, age are being discriminated against. Is it as easy for a black person to rent or get an apartment on a sharing platform of apartments, or is it not? And why? You know, what is artificial intelligence doing in this sense? And to what precision can people be targeted, on what uncertainties, with what decisive impact to tilt a majority? Indeed, it can be very, very precisely targeted. So while the phenomenon may not be new, I think we have to recognize that the technologies create an accelerator, a catalyst, a sort of steroids of the phenomenon that makes certain players very powerful.
Is Rand Waltzman in here? Rand. Very good question, I got to say. So I'm going to read Rand's question. He says, when will we be able to have serious discussions of actual defense against cognitive attacks of mass manipulation and influence beyond simply admiring the problem? So a little bit snarky, but I admire the snarkiness. But there is a certain kind of admiration, a certain kind of ongoing explication. But what he's asking for is a playbook and a game plan. Samir?
Yeah, I think the playbook, you have three options. One, adopt the Chinese model. That's one option, which is clearly not an option, which means you start censoring and you start controlling flow of information and you create heavy legislation. Second is you move towards a community-led approach where the companies come up with self-regulatory principles. They invest in technology. They invest in AI to weed out manipulation and fake news, and they are transparent about it. We need to know algorithms. We need to know what's going into them. I think that's transparency by what the big platform is extremely important. And they don't do that. And third, and I think this is extremely important, is that we need governments now to start catalyzing and incentivizing media companies who are actually being able to weed out spam. So I think there is a need to start giving certain certificates or certain stars, ratings to platforms that are doing this job admirably.
But you want to be really careful with this, because when you talk about fake news, if you said we want to have our security, we want to be secure against fake news, the first guy to say, amen, I'm on board, would be Vladimir Putin. And probably Donald Trump would join up too, because to a lot of people, fake news means news I don't like or that is critical of me. So I think you have to be a little...
No, I am actually completely averse to the idea of anyone having the ability to decide what is the truth and what is fake. I don't think Jack at Twitter should be able to decide that. Then they've been doing it, and I don't like it. They've been banning certain handles, which I'm completely against, and I don't want some unknown algorithm in Facebook to come up with that conclusion. Yeah. So transparency in the process is extremely important. Yeah.
There was a global young leader who posted a question that has disappeared from here. Do you know who you were? Yeah, okay. Can we bring a microphone to this gentleman? It was a good question, and it's just not here now, so I want to give you a whack at this. Go ahead, and tell us your name.
Oh, I'm Martin Czepesa. I'm here from Bratislava, and I'm part of the GELF. And my question was that with the Internet of Things, there needs to be a regulation on that. I'm just because if you have everything powered and connected to the internet, it's extremely vulnerable to attack. Do you at least agree on some parts what can be done to prevent this?
Thank you. Internet of Things and making that world safe.
So, Michael? I do think you're like with, for example, food safety or automotive safety, we will probably need to have a set of standards that require so-called, smart objects to have certain kinds of security features, changeable passwords, update capability, the ability to patch and fix things. What will ultimately drive that will be the following. when something really bad happens, like someone gets killed, and there's a lawsuit, and someone turns to the manufacturer of the device and says, "You're responsible," that'll wake everybody up. Now, ideally, you don't want to wait for that, but I do think there is room now for having some regulatory requirements on safety and security.
But let me ask you, right now, the U.S. economy and I would say the European economy drive a lot of the regulatory environment because of the weight they have in the global system. What about in 20 years when China is the dominant consumer? It's no longer as dependent upon the consumption patterns in the regulatory environments, and so the bulk of the weight of regulatory direction, all of that is outside of our system, and the norms are quite radically different. How do we manage that, Michael? Do we try to segment ourselves off somehow and say we need to protect ourselves and do what you will in China that won't perhaps have all those protections? How do we live in that system?
Well, you see a little bit of that now. When you do business in China, there are certain rules the Chinese set in terms of how you have to house the data and what how amenable it has to be to process. Now, what the companies have done up to now is they said, okay, with respect to Chinese citizens, we're going to do that. What will happen when the condition of doing business is you have to do it not just for Chinese citizens, but for everybody?
Yeah.
Then I think you're going to get back into this issue of competing legal and governmental systems that are struggling over an internet without borders. And it may be that that's going to be a challenge.
But also technical standards.
Yeah.
We already see that. So questions of trust are already being fought out through technology and over the open internet. I mean, we're seeing a fairly high-profile case now in the United States between the president's appreciation for ZTE, Chinese tech company, which has violated sanctions. There are concerns about whether there are built-in backdoors, which could be activated at any moment in time. And so the question of trust and baking it into standards also relates to this question of Internet of Things. It could also take a more layered approach where I think certain technical solutions will address technical weaknesses. So, for example, if we think about Internet of Things, but it may also be possible for backdoors, if a weakness or a vulnerability is signaled that another device, like a router or another element of making it connected, will sort of block and cut off that certain device that's outdated and that's potentially posing a risk to the system. So I trust that beyond governance, which I think, of course, is essential in all of this, there will be technological solutions to address the trust issues and to weed out risk from safe.
I want to bring in Olaf. We're going to go over here, but I want to point out Joe Nye's in the room, and he actually has a great George Orwell blurb on the book, which we'll read to later. But I that's what put it in my mind, Joe. So they haven't seen this, but I'll read your great blurb in a moment. But Olaf?
Yeah, on the Internet of Things issue, that's a very broad issue. It is not one type of Internet of Things. There is things for cities, there are things for power grids, there are things for consumers. Having that conversation for each of those sectors, I think, is a very important piece. And as Marietje just said, there are technological, there are regulatory, there are consumer interventions that can be had. And that needs to be figured out. And societies have started these conversations and actually have started taking actions around these by self-regulation programs, by consumer testing, by the Australian government has just started a multi-stakeholder program in order to set the expectations within Canada about how to deal with IoT and IoT securities. What's the Canadian approach? And they're working with civil society, industry, government itself to figure out what is a good approach.
Real quick, Samir?
No, a very quick intervention. I think the question that relates to, the aspect that relates to this panel is on the million data points that IoT generates around each of us, which allows sociological profiling, and the ability to manipulate or influence that person today is much greater due to this particular reality, and therefore the data collection that the IoT does and helps profile all of us has to be regulated and monitored and managed in some ways. I think that's the point that you are raising, that can it implicate how democracy operates because of the devices everywhere that monitors every part of our, every aspect of our life.
But as smart cities are built out today, and that conversation has not been held, you're probably yourself in the best position to go to your municipality and say, you're bringing all these devices into the roads. What about my rights as an individual to not be monitored? What about my rights to not be tracked with my Wi-Fi and Bluetooth signal? That's probably a much better conversation to have at your local level than to wait for a big global and international treaty.
By that time,
or
it's
something.
gone.
Yeah.
You know, let me
That's
tell you
fine.
an interesting story along the line. We have something in the U.S. called Easy Pass. When you
Yeah.
go through a toll booth, it automatically, pays your toll. And
Then
early
you can
on,
never lie about where you were.
well, so
Yeah.
early on, the police someone said, you know what, we can use this to give traffic tickets out. Because mathematically, if you go 20 miles in a certain period of time, you had to have been speeding. And ultimately, the Easy Pass people said, if you do that, no one will ever adopt Easy Pass. And so they decided not to do it. So you can use these kinds of sentences
I
to
never
drive
thought about
Well,
that.
laws matter.
Yeah.
No, legal protection matters. I think
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah,
bottom line.
right here.
Yeah.
And then,
Hello, Edward Lucas from CEPA. I've got a question about identity assurance, because the internet is really good at giving us the right to be anonymous, and that's sort of built in from the beginning. It's much less good at giving us the right to prove who we are and the right to check who we're dealing with, which we take for granted in real life. So my question is how far is that going to be the job of government to give us strong digital IDs? We don't all have the good fortune to be Estonians, which is obviously where it comes as birthright. How far is that going to evolve as something that you get from all sorts of different private sector or non-profit providers? So where are we going to get that digital infrastructure that allows us to prove who we are, to make decisions, and ultimately to authenticate data about us?
This is
really important.
This
in the
is a
era of
great
deepfake.
question about the tension between anonymity and its antithesis, because the other side of it is, in an authoritarian regime, anonymity is a very important part of the picture. So I have the same question, but you're sort of saying you seem to be advocating moving out of the anonymous zones into something where we're all out as who we
I
are.
would go to the street with bricks and bottles to defend the right to be anonymous. It's tremendously important in China and Russia. And I absolutely don't want this idea that you can't get on the internet without an internet driving license.
I mean, I increasingly want an anonymous in Trump's Washington.
Yeah, sure. So anonymous is really important, and
Yeah.
encryption should be
Right.
more.
So the-
not less. But I also want to be able to, when I get an email from someone
Yeah.
saying it's you, I want to be able to know that it's you. I would like to have
Right.
your signature.
So that's
Maricha,
the Indian debate,
Samir?
right? That's like we've bought, I think in the last few years, 3 or 4 years, we've given 1.19 billion digital ID numbers, linking up your banking to your subsidies, to your tax, to your water bills, electricity, mobile phones, and you have this digital ID program, and you have half the country up in arms protesting against it. That we
Right.
don't want this kind of a all-encompassing digital program that tracks all of our activities. So that's so in India we are seeing a pitched battle, and eventually the Supreme Court of India is hearing this case, that whether the government has the right or whether there should be such such universal program that links up all aspects under one single number. And of course there are fixes. We can have tokenization, which helps with anonymity, and you can have distributed ledgers and blockchain technologies that protect our individual securities. But I think that is essential. Anonymity, and certain countries have in a sense forfeited anonymity. Estonia, we have a friend here
Right.
who has a layered anonymity program, which means everyone has an ID, but there is a very strict penalty if someone tries to breaches that ID program. So if you were speeding a car, the policeman has the right to access your information, your car information, and your personal information to send a ticket to. But if a health collector was to do the same, he would be severely punished.
Right.
So I think we will have to look at some innovative ways where anonymity is not absolute,
Right.
but certainly it is defendable by the Constitution.
Michael,
and by
you're not on Twitter, as best I can tell. Are you lurking there anonymously?
No,
in
I
some
don't.
other
I don't
fake
do. I don't
account?
do any social media. I have a very kind of modest.
Yeah, if you
footprint.
don't, then how do you know so much about it? Like,
He was in the wrong office.
He has all
Yeah.
the time to observe.
yeah.
Exactly right.
I do. I'm gonna go to this our young leader here, and then I do want to go to Joe Nye to take the no. You get to go before Joe. But go ahead. Yes. Tell us who you are.
May I return?
Yeah, sure.
Return to that anonymous identity is always context specific.
Yeah.
So the identity that you use in order to interact with your government may be a different identity that you use in order to do business. My credit card number is different than my social security number. I think that's a very important aspect to keep in mind. And those numbers do not always need to be correlated, or sometimes must not be correlated to each other. And I think that, so from that technical perspective, I think you have to keep that in the back of your mind when you're talking about these things.
Yes.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Sandra Lisočić, and I'm also a Young Leaders Forum participant. I'm coming from Serbia. As the title of this session says, it's Cyber Threats to Democracy. And in the description, it actually mentioned American elections and how this information was shared.
I didn't read that section, but I'm glad you've raised it.
It was mentioned there, and my question is actually, I'm coming from like a Western Balkan country, what happens when actually this information, fake news, false news, etc., is shared by the government or by the political parties that are actually in power, or opposition, national television, private companies that have some deals with the political parties?
This is a wonderful. Can I add to your question for a minute to the panel? So Senator Mark Warner, who's not here, we tried to get him to come, but he's commented. He and Senator Burr were two of the first in a hearing that was related to a staff member from Homeland Security that surfaced the issue that then there were 21 states whose election systems were penetrated. It's now known to be 39 states, but at the time, Warner and Burr were so sharp in trying to deal with this woman from Homeland Security, and at that time, John Kelly was Secretary of Homeland Security, and he became explosive because he was so upset that he saw them discussing what he considered to be classified information. There is this tension over making smart strategy on what to do in terms of protecting election systems, but even getting it discussed in a real way. It's been very hard to do in the United States, and there's still a lot of pieces of the puzzle that haven't been out there. So just to ask this question about campaigns, election systems, and where the needle goes, again, it seems to me to be getting much, much worse, not better. So what can be done to respond? Is that a fair add-on?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, what happens when, we don't actually always have same cyber threats to democracy? It's not always the foreign actor that is the threat. Sometimes it comes within the domestic actors, and that's my question.
I think that's a brilliant question.
Thank you. Samir?
I think in one of the TV debates in New Delhi, which was happening around the Cambridge Analytica episode, I clearly said that it is the two largest political parties in India who have created a market for companies like Cambridge Analytica to operate on. It is democracy itself that got into the business of collecting personal information. And this is not new again. This is, if you ask an MP or an MLA or a parliamentarian anywhere in the world, they'll tell you, I know all my households. I know all my people. Because they have been collecting information. They have been creating their campaigns to respond to that.
Is anybody trying to penetrate your election systems?
Of course. And I said it on television that imagine if you use the same asymmetry example I said, Russia and USA. Imagine if one of our neighbors who loves us so much decides to use that cheaper option of destabilizing one thing that we have and they don't, which is democracy. Yeah. So imagine a smaller country with smaller resources could pretty much buy the same data set and buy the same expertise that Cambridge Analytica provides to political parties. Once you have created the market for perversion of personal information, then any actor can use that particular market space to their benevolent or malicious intent.
I think there are two big differences between the question you asked and the addition that you made, because on the one hand, there are illegal acts, subversive penetrations, whether they come from the inside or the outside, basically attacking the system that is supposed to facilitate votes or other core elements of democracy, or weaponizing or using personal data a certain way. But you also address the issue of disinformation, sharing from the government side or otherwise, or in coalitions with media companies that really blur the picture that people have. And I think we have to be careful not to put those in the same basket, because there are tasks and checks and balances that can apply with verification methods to how votes are cast. Like in my own country, the Netherlands, we vote with a paper and a red pencil. And it allows for citizens to petition the voting commission and then the court, if necessary, to actually double check the papers that have to be stored in a certain way.
So you're choosing analog.
Correct.
Many countries will choose analog as a backup option, and I think looking at backup options and checks and balances within the system to verify and cross-verify are very important. Again, laws matter. What is the responsibility of the state? But it cannot be compared to the notion of where a pluralist, free speech-driven debate merges with subversive disinformation, and tools that can be used, also technological tools like bots, like impersonations, like maybe even pretending that somebody has said something that they haven't. And that's a whole different debate where I think we need to also really think about building resilience from the bottom up. This is certainly not only a technological problem. And if we look only at disinformation and sort of challenges to democratic resilience through a tech lens, we're missing a lot of the picture. It always falls on a foundation of mistrust. Oftentimes, disinformation has some kind of kernel of a legitimate criticism that it really blows up. So I think the answer to a lot of the issues you addressed is more speech, more education, and more democratic resilience from the bottom up in both technological and analog is the word.
By the way, one, just to add, I agree with all that, and to add something, the latest emerging concern is something that some people call deep fake, which is where you are able to alter a video or audio in a way that's actually undetectable, so you can graft the face of your opponent onto a video, and it will look as if the person's doing that. And that's going to further be a technical challenge to the issue of trust.
But most likely there will be some sort of technological solutions like watermarking, etc.
30-second insight before I jump to Joe.
What I zoom in on that aspect of learning to critically think and address the information you get to us. Going back to history, after the Restoration, English history, the Royal Society was put up.
Right.
And that was exactly to address the value of truth. The value.
Can I get 30 seconds? I think this is an important number I want to throw out there. Because it's important for youngsters.
Fast.
We have roughly 250 million teenagers in India, which simply put means we are sending out 25 million new voters every year. Now, at the age of 13, they are more informed by the short tweets and Facebook posts than the long form. So imagine their truth, their world, their impressions, their perceptions are shaped by this, by these short tweets, synthetic truth, by these altered images, by deep propagandas than any other long form that can respond to.
Thank you. Fantastic question. I'm going to cut you off, Olaf, just a second, but fantastic question before I corrupted it with my own comments. But in responding to my own comments, I also think it's incumbent on governments to get this out on the table. I find it absolutely embarrassing and outrageous that we don't have clear communication between intelligence agencies, between the Department of Homeland Security and those people running elections in states, and that there still remains a huge information gap. And therefore, you have, in our case, U.S. government actually aiding and abetting by kind of a dereliction of responsibility in my book, what helping states prepare and deal with it, which was part of the question.
But in the United States, haven't these two problems come together in one? In other words, isn't challenging the technological infrastructure and the electoral infrastructure now a subject of such polarized debate that it has become a lack of an actual, checks and balances?
But one side
kind
is
of
holding
debate.
much more information than the other in that
Exactly.
debate. That's a problem.
But I think this is a double-layered problem for that reason.
We're right near the end, but I want to come to Joe Nye and George Orwell. Joe?
Well, I think you're referring, Steve, to the quote I did for Mike Chertoff's excellent book.
Yeah, it says, when George Orwell wrote 1984, little did he suspect that most of us would willingly carry the tools of our surveillance in our own pockets. Michael Chertoff brings his unmatched legal skills and experience to propose together restrictions on the use, retention, and dissemination of the data that is exploding around us. The important book is a vote for sanity in the midst of chaotic change. I love this blurb.
And that leads...
So do I. Thank you.
I'm going to buy the book now. Only
that
because
leads
of
to
your
the
blurb.
question, which is, if we all voluntarily put Big Brother in our pockets and turn him on deliberately, what is the one thing in a sort of a 30-second response that each of you would put top of the list to protect our privacy in a democracy? What should the Dutch government do, the American government do, the European Parliament do, and the Indian government do? I don't want the whole list. I just want the
So we have 4 minutes.
top of your list.
We have 4 minutes before we have to close. So I love the 30-second rule. Olaf?
Force accountability and transparency.
Oh, great. More time for you.
I think that the use of data, however generated, has to be subject to rules that allow the data subject to have a say.
Maritia?
think in terms of rights. If you have a right to privacy, then there are limits to whatever the device in your pocket, and whoever owns the data can be collected, what it can be used for. I think another element that's essential here is antitrust and competition. So what kind of sets can be merged because of big company mergers, and what are the consequences? I don't think there's enough appreciation for the antitrust and competition elements of the use of data.
Samir, you get actually a full minute. Now they're
I think
saying don't end too early.
No. So Joe, I think
You can talk more slowly. You're the fastest talker on the panel.
I have to
Stretch
get so
it out
much
a little
I have to
bit.
get so much in, and I was 1 in 1.2 billion people, so you had to get a lot in, and very quickly. But anyways, I think essentially data integrity. So if we have control over our data, who uses it for what purpose, when is it deleted and erased, and if I had retained agency over me, because data is now me, I think that is a regulation and that is a regulatory framework all governments must move towards. Everything else is business.
Fascinating. What a great time. I feel as if, the one thing I can take from this, and also thank you for provoking us with your book, your forthcoming book, Exploding Data, is I feel like there's a race underway. There's a race to try to get this right, and it is an urgent, serious, and almost dangerous race to get wrong. And I want to thank all of you for this, a very serious, thoughtful discussion. Thank you guys. You've been a great audience, and I will. I keep telling people, since I'm not really buying the drinks, but I'll buy you a drink here. At a reception that we're having for those of you I wasn't able to get to your Slido questions. But big round of applause for Samir Saran, for Maricha Shake, for Michael Chertoff, and Olaf Kolkman. Fantastic panel and discussion. And I should say, as you go at 12:30 in here, we can continue in this sort of thing with the age of bots and the robotization of truth, and in the Danube space, Ukraine out of tune with Europe. So those are the next two sessions you can enjoy. Thank you guys very much.